Hi, everybody. I hope you're having a good week. This week we are starting with our first set of theories. And our first set of theories falls under what's known as classical and neoclassical thought. These lines of thought, these perspectives focus on choice or consequences. So that's why the chapter is called Choice or Consequence. Okay. So when we are um, talking about classical thought, it should be known that classical thought is like a school of thought within criminology, and it's really one of the first ones that existed within criminology. Crime was not really a thing in primitive societies. They had their own ideas of what was considered right and wrong behavior, but they weren't necessarily written down into a criminal law that everybody was aware of. So that's what they mean when violation of law did not necessarily exist. But we as people who have lived in formed societies have really only always had this idea of what's right and what's wrong. Sociologists call such fundamental concepts of morality and propriety mores and folkways. So, mores and folkways, what they are terms that describe basic forms of behavioral strictures imposed by social groups upon their members. So, before we had criminal law, we had these overarching perspectives and ideas of what people should, how people should behave. So mores are referring to things that are more serious. So we're going to be talking about rape, murder, robbery, things that most people can agree are just bad, inherently bad behavior. Um, the folkways, however, are time honored customs. So these are just things that everyone is used to doing, and then all of a sudden people, change it up, switch things around. So your book gives an example of how men used to never wear jewelry, maybe a wedding ring, but that was really it, unless you were super, super rich. But now it's a lot more common to see men wearing things like chains or earrings or rings on their fingers, even if they're not, in the super wealthy classes. So obviously, changing that time-honored custom from men not wearing jewelry to wearing jewelry is not something that's going to threaten the survival of our species of humans. So that's what that means by folkways. Um, Nowadays, well, we moved from mores and folkways into a more serious determination focused on actual criminal behavior known as mala in se and mala prohibita. So we still use these words in criminology, although they're not as widely popular as they used to be, because obviously these are Latin terms that were one of the first ways of kind of delineating what type of crime categories things can fall under. So mala and se crimes are similar to what we called mores before. These are fundamentally wrong things to do, regardless of when they occur or where they occur. So these are, again, things like murder, rape, robbery. Most people can get behind the fact that these are bad behaviors, evil behaviors. So that's what mala in se means. Mala prohibita refers to acts that are wrong in areas where they're prohibited. So everyone might not agree on something falling under the category mala prohibita being a crime, but all we know is that it is a crime because there's a law against it. So, for example, gambling is technically illegal, but in some areas like Nevada, and now in different states they have sports gambling that's legal, and it never was legal before. And so these are things that are going to fall under that category of mala prohibita. Um, it's important to note that we went through a stage right before classical criminology really took off, known as the demonic era. And during this time, it was normal. It was a typical thing to do when somebody committed a crime to blame extra not extraterrestrial, but forces that are beyond the person. So personal deviance ranged from demonic possession to spiritual influences to temptation by fallen angels. So basically, if you committed a crime, people would say that you were possessed by the devil or a demon, or that something was spiritually wrong with you. Not that you chose to commit a crime, not that there was necessarily something wrong with society that made you choose a crime, but that you were possessed by an evil influence of some type. And therefore, a lot of times the punishments would be severe, and they weren't really helpful in actually solving the crime problem, whether it be to um, make amends for what was for the wrongs that were done, or to rehabilitate the offender to stop them from committing future crimes. So keeping all that in mind, we evolved eventually into, a more civilized society. And so we can actually trace back our sources of criminal law all the way to Babylon, and the Code of Hum, I can't ever pronounce it, Hammurabi. So before this, there doesn't mean that there weren't any laws or codes that people followed before this. It's just that this is one of the first ones that we know of that was actually written down, and we still have copies of what was written down at that time, at least most of it. Modern criminal law is the result of long evolution of legal principles. The Code of Hammurabi spoke to issues of theft, property ownership, sexual relationships, interpersonal violence. It also uh, described different punishments. So things like retribution was a big thing. So getting back at the people that committed these crimes, but instead of allowing the victims to be the ones delivering the retribution, it kind of took it out of their hands and it put it more in the hands of the government or the state by having it written down and saying what the punishments were supposed to be for certain crimes. So that means that, if you steal something, there is a written down punishment for it, and that the person that you stole from should not be going and committing, murder as retribution for something like that. Then fast forward a couple of, hundreds of years, and we get to the Roman. So early Roman law was again one of the first penal codes that we have, that was actually written down that we can still reference. And they have what was known as the 12 tables. And the 12 tables appear to have been based on common and fair practices that were generally accepted among early tribes that existed prior to the Roman Republic. So they basically took customs, um, agreed upon ways of behaving, of interacting with individuals that were already in place, and just made them into rules, actual rules that were written down and enforced by people. When we look at the Justinian Code, which came about towards the end of Roman rule, we see some serious contributions that are made that we still use today. Uh, the and one of those things was that we delineate between public law and private law. That's still something that we do today, although it's a little bit different than what it was back when it was first created by the Justinian Code, which said that public laws dealt with the organization of the Roman state, its senate, and governmental offices. So they really meant public, like as in the overarching government that was ruling all the people. Private law, on the other hand, was concerned with contracts, personal possessions, legal status of various people, injuries to citizens, more personal one on one things that were happening amongst the everyday people, and not so much what was going on with the government themselves. Okay, then fast forward another, hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, and we have what's known as common law. I guess not thousands of years, hundreds of years fast forward, and we have what's known as common law. So, common law was based on shared traditions and standards and was supported by court decisions during the Middle Ages. So, that is really what this boils down to. And we still use common law today. If you want to go to law school, if that's something that you plan on doing in the future, you're going to know a lot about common law and precedent. So, common law, if we go back to the times of, feudal states in England, uh, when people had an issue that they could not resolve on their own, they would go to the king's court. So the king would hold court, let's say every Sunday, and anybody who had a grievance could come and talk to the king about their grievance, and he would, make a ruling about the grievance. And those rulings became known as precedent or common law. So this was stuff that was talked about, and then anyone else who had a similar problem that fell under, similar circumstances to that problem that was already solved by the king, was now going to be solved in that same way. So that's what we mean by unwritten legal precedents. They were handed down as judgments from the king, and then everyone was supposed to follow the rules based on what that judgment was made. So today, courts are often going to use precedent in order to argue for their case. So if you want to go to law school, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be doing case studies over and over and over again. And that's going to help you. So if a client comes to you in the future and says, this is what's happened to me, you'll say, okay, well, this has happened in a similar case and this was what the outcome was. So this is what we can expect. And that is all based on common law that was made, really became a thing during the Middle Ages. Okay, so fast forward even more through history, and we have the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was not originally made to address criminal laws in any way, but it became kind of a cornerstone for certain things that we have now. So the Magna Carta itself ensured feudal rights, which basically meant that people who were living on in the feudal system had some type of rights and had some stake in society, because a lot of times, if you lived in a feudal state, you worked on a farm and you worked your butt off and you owned nothing. You didn't own your house, you didn't own the food that you were growing, you didn't own the livestock that you were tending to, you owned nothing. So the Magna Carta was a way to try to give people in that position a little bit more power, so they had something that they were trying to work toward. It also addressed that the king could not encroach on landowners' privileges, ensured the freedom of the church, and respect for customs of different towns. Because if you went in and had a certain town that was used to doing things a certain way, and somebody who never lived there, who's never been a part of that area, then declared it to be illegal to do those things, you were going to have a lot of people inadvertently breaking the law. So that's basically what they were trying to stop from happening for that. But like I said, the Magna Carta really became the cornerstone for the two things that we see today. The U.S. Supreme Court has the power of judicial review, which basically says that the U.S. Supreme Court can review legislation that is passed by either the executive body or the legislative body, and it can declare it unconstitutional. And so basically strike down those laws. And that's based on that, the king cannot encroach on certain privileges kind of idea. Magna Carta is also the basis for the modern legal procedure known as the due process of law. So if you take a criminal justice course, you're going to hear all about due process and learn all about it. That's not really for this course. But the idea behind it is that people have to be treated fairly throughout the time where we're deciding whether or not they actually committed a crime. And that's all based on, the Magna Carta. That was something that came around very, very long time ago. Okay, so now we have the Enlightenment era. So while all these laws and things were happening and developing over time, we had a highly significant social movement that occurred during the 17th and 18th centuries. The thinking of this time from the intellectuals of this era really helped change, fueled social change. A big thing that a lot of the scholars of this time were pushing was that the government should exist to serve and protect its people, and not just the people that hold political power, but all of the citizens in the world. A lot of the scholars talked about the social contract, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. But as you can see, this type of thinking led to things like the French and American Revolution, because this was the whole idea of, we are free people, we want to be treated like free people, and we're tired of people that have the status of king, that have we're lucky enough to be born into that line, making all the decisions and hurting the people that make up the country. Um, if you think that the top 1% now is a small group, which it is, just think about how much smaller it was when you could not work your way up into, a position of status and you were really just born into it. Or maybe you got lucky and you married into it. But it wasn't something where we have the American dream now where you can, work your butt off and advance in society over time. And that really wasn't a thing before. So just imagine how small that top 1% was, way back in the day. And that really angered the majority of the population. And this is really where it came to a head, was during the Enlightenment era. So some of the more influential scholars of the time of in the Enlightenment time, we have Thomas Hobbes. He's really the one that came up with the idea of the social contract. And so what he said was that humans, enter into a social contract with one another to create a state that demands the surrender of certain natural rights and submission to the absolute authority of a sovereign while offering protection to its citizens. So this is the first person to really point out the fact that, hey, we give up some of our personal freedoms that we have in order to live in society. And when we give up some of these personal freedoms, we expect to get back certain things like protection, against, whatever it is at the time. If you're talking about Thomas Hobbes, he was theorizing back way before even these revolutions happened. So not only is he talking about, protection from, um, like nowadays we expect the government to protect us from things like the pandemic. So, okay, if we have to close down businesses, what are you going to do to help save our businesses? But at this time, he was not only talking about that, but also things like, hey, let's put up some walls to protect us from the wild animals that are running around. Things like that. We, give up some of our personal freedoms, in order to live in a civilized society, but we expect things back from that as well. John Locke is a super famous philosopher. He's come up with a bunch of really great ideas that have been passed down and influence our everyday lives today. But for our purposes, the big one that he came up with was this idea of tabula rasa, which basically meant that humans are born a blank slate and we are influenced by our life experiences. So instead of being born with certain inclinations to one thing or another, we're born with nothing, and we learn everything over time. So that was his big contribution, and he also said that through the social contract, humans abandon their natural state of individual freedom and lack of interpersonal responsibility to join together and form society. Once the government is formed, it's obligated to assume responsibility towards its citizens, to provide for their protection and welfare, and to guarantee certain unalienable rights. So, life, health, liberty, possessions. So, just taking Thomas Hobbes' idea of the social contract and kind of expanding on it and making it more specific. John Locke also was responsible for proposing the idea of checks and balances within government, which we obviously use today. Then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he also, expanded upon this idea of the social contract. He said that humans are basically good and fair in their natural state. So, building on Thomas Hobbes, building on John Locke, he basically said that when we're born, we're these blank slates that are pure and good, and we, are not inherently evil individuals. It is that after we are, living in society and we realize what, how society functions and how we need to survive within society, that we can be corrupted. So we are corrupted by the introduction of shared concepts and joint activities. So things like owning property, agriculture, science, commerce, all these things that are not natural to humans that we created over time, in order to advance our species, is what made us evil, or corrupted as a species. And so therefore, civilized people agree to establish governments and systems of education to correct the problems and inequalities brought on by the rise of civilization. So, what he was saying is that as we develop as a society, as we progress as a society, there are more and more temptations out there to go against, the social contract that we have with everyone else that says, hey, I won't mess up your life if you don't mess up my life. And then, it got to the point where these temptations were too great. So we asked a sovereign body, the government, which we create, we vote, we make up, and we ask them to help stop, the problems that we're experiencing. So who's gonna stop the people from committing these, acts of, of stealing, of theft, of crime, of whatever it is? If it shouldn't be up to the individual citizens. It should be up to a, objective third party to be the one to hand out those types of punishments, according to Rousseau. Then he also put a lot of emphasis on, natural law, which basically means that, certain immutable laws are fundamental to human nature. So when we hear, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness being unalienable rights, that's stuff that's, from natural law. Natural law originally was intended to promote religious laws only, and stated that human law that went against, natural law was corrupt in the eyes of God. And that's really what it was supposed to be for at the beginning. So if you remember what life was like before, um, we had these, separation of church and state and things like that. The Catholic Church in particular, when we're talking about England, uh, had a very strong, hold on politics in the area in the time period, and they are the ones that created the laws that were passed down, supposedly from God, and they would get very upset when man-made laws or human laws, were in contradiction to anything that was considered a natural law. So Rousseau kind of reworked the way that natural law, was thought about so that we could include, human law and natural law together. And then Thomas Paine, he focused a lot on natural rights, which are rights that individuals retain in the face of government action and interest. So, natural rights for Thomas Paine were the things that we are born with that the government cannot take away, regardless of the laws and things that they are making. So it goes along with that idea of natural law of, God gave us these laws, God gave us these, rights and abilities, and you cannot take these things away by creating your own laws. Obviously, we can see a lot of this in the Constitution, and Paine focused on natural rights when he was helping write the Constitution. So that's why we see a lot of that influence, in our own Constitution. Okay, so all of this is building up to the classical school of thought. And again, what's important to note about the classical school is it's really criminology's kind of first school of thought. So the Enlightenment period led to the development of classical school of criminology because we were the scholars, the intellectuals of the time, were tired of explaining criminal behavior by, they were possessed. It was an evil spirit that came and made them commit crime. These intellectuals that were experiencing all these revolutions and things like that at the time decided that no, it's not possession. People are able to make their own choices. People have free will. People control their own lives. And they make the conscious choice as to whether or not they're going to break the law or break the social contract, however you want to look at it. So the most influential person when we are talking about the classical school of criminology is going to be Cesar Beccaria. So he's known kind of as the first criminologist because he is the kind of the father of the classical school of criminology. And so he really made his mark by taking this and elaborating on it to the point where we could have actual kind of testable theory. So the idea that that Cesar Beccaria put out there was that people are pleasure-seeking individuals. People are able to make their own choices, and sometimes they make bad choices because they want to maximize their pleasure and minimize their pain. So, therefore, his focus was on punishment in particular. He stated that the purpose of punishment should be deterrence, not retribution, and punishment should be imposed to prevent offenders from committing additional crimes. So, prevent people from committing crimes altogether, and if you've already committed a crime, you should be punished to the point where you don't want to commit in any additional crimes. Um, mm, mm, mm. So, one of the quotes from Cesar Beccaria that really fits into this line of thinking is that in order for punishment not to be in every instance an act of violence of one or of many against a private citizen, it must be essentially prompt or public, prompt, necessary, the least possible in the given circumstances, proportionate to the crimes, and dictated by the laws. So, what that is saying, it's a mouthful of a sentence, but what it is saying is that we do not want people to just randomly be lashing out at people who committed crimes. So, let's say that I wake up one day and my cows have been stolen, and I know that it's my neighbor that stole my cows because they have been jealous of my cows. They're jealous of my farm. They're jealous of me and how awesome I am. So I know it's them who stole my cows. So I'm going to go and I'm going to shoot them because they stole my cows. This was a way of saying, hey, let's just knock that nonsense off and try things in a more civilized approach. So instead of private citizens going against each other or a mob of private citizens going against one individual, let's have these things written down with matching punishment. So this is a crime, this is the punishment. He argued that in order for a punishment to stop crime from happening, it must satisfy three criteria. It must be swift, which means that the punishment has to come very shortly after the crime was committed. It must be, we'll do certain first. It must be certain, meaning that if you committed a crime, you know for certain that you are going to get a punishment that comes with it, and severe, but not severe to the point where you steal a loaf of bread and you get the death penalty. Severe and punishment should only be severe enough to outweigh the personal benefits to be derived from the crime. Any additional punishment is unnecessary and can actually create problems. So he believed that, uh, so yes, that's what that means. So he also determined that there's three different types of crime. Ones that threaten the security of the state, or, the state meaning wherever you're living, the state, the government, the country, the town, whatever it is. Crimes that injure citizens or individual property, and crimes that run contrary to the social order. So that would today be things like public order crimes. So things that we, don't like, because they seem to violate morality. Cesar Beccaria also had a huge influence on what we now call the Bill of Rights. And this comes from his belief that no man can be called guilty before a judge has sentenced him, nor can society deprive him of public protection before it has been decided that he is in fact, in violation of the conditions under which such protection was accorded him. So again, the Bill of Rights focuses a lot on the due process, which I just had mentioned in another slide. Due process is not really something that we're going to go over in this class, but the idea is that you are innocent until proven guilty by the court of law, and the government has certain responsibilities in making sure that you receive a fair trial. And this all comes from Cesar Beccaria, who also believed it was important to have a jury of one's peers, in order for them to really understand the surrounding circumstances of a crime before handing down any type of punishment. Again, something that you'll find in the Bill of Rights. Okay, so Beccaria is, like I said, one of the fathers of criminology. He is the one that really, got things rolling in the field. Jeremy Bentham was right behind him. He published a book called Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, where he focused on the ideas of pain and pleasure. He advocated that punishment should be sufficiently distasteful to the offender that the discomfort experienced would outweigh the pleasure to be derived from criminal activity. So similar, if not the same exact thing that Beccaria was saying, he just said it in a different way, and was saying that, the government needs to use these two ideas when deciding what punishment should be made. We need to make the punishment enough that, that whatever pleasure was going to be received from the crime itself is not worth it anymore, because the punishment is worse than that pleasure. So not we don't need to go crazy. We just need to make sure that it crosses that line. Once you cross that line and say, the punishment is pretty bad and it's not worth that, the pleasure that I'm going to get from this crime is not worth dealing with that type of punishment, then you have succeeded in deterring crime. So that's the whole idea behind it. Okay, so he also came up with this idea of hedonistic calculus, also called utilitarianism. This states that individuals weigh the consequences of their behavior before acting. So people think things through, and they make conscious decisions in order to maximize their pleasure and minimize pain. So this is the definition for hedonistic calculus is the belief that behavior holds value to any individual undertaking it according to the amount of pleasure or pain it can be expected to produce for that person. And that is what the government needs to keep in mind when they are coming up with punishments for crimes. They need to be able to, make sure that the pain the pain outweighs the pleasure, so that somebody who is rationally thinking about these things chooses not to commit that crime because they don't want to deal with the negative consequences that are associated with it. So, just like pain, just like the displeasure that's associated with punishment, the value of any pleasure can be calculated by things like intensity. So, how intense is that pleasure going to be? How much excitement is involved? How much, pleasure is going to be uh, resulting from whatever criminal behavior that is being carried out. How long is that pleasure going to be? Is it just going to be for a second? Because if you're only going to get 10 seconds of pleasure and a lot of punishment, 5 years in prison for 10 seconds of pleasure, it's definitely not going to be worth it. So duration is important. Certainty is a big one. So am I certain to get pleasure from this thing, or is it only a possibility? Because if it's only a possibility that I'm going to receive pleasure from committing this crime, but I'm definitely going to get, a serious punishment for this crime, then it's not going to be worth it. And immediacy. So how long am I going to have to wait for this to pay off? If I'm stealing something that has monetary value and I'm really just doing it because I want the money, but I steal the product and now I have to sell it in order to get the money, the immediacy is not there. So it's going to take longer. And if someone can catch me and stop me and punish me before I even sell this thing and make the money that I want, then I'm not even getting close to seeing the pleasure before I'm experiencing the pain of my punishment. So all those things are things that he would recommend to take into consideration when forming punishments for specific crimes. He also came up with certain crime prevention strategies that we are still used to use somewhat, at least today. The panopticon is not something we use today, although we still sometimes use this design. The panopticon was a prison that was circular, that had cells along the circumference, and each cell was clearly visible from a central location. And in that central location, there were guards that could see everybody and see everything that was going on. The panopticon was constructed either very close to a city or within the city so that people were walking by could see, okay, I don't want to be there. So it was an example to citizens of what would happen to them should they commit crimes. And, the visualization of it, seeing it in the middle of their city should be enough for them to say, okay, yeah, no, that's not something I want to be a part of. That's not something I want to do. So I'm not going to do any crimes or anything that will make me have to go there. Another crime prevention strategy from Bentham was the centralized police force. So he proposed that instead of having just all these random people out patrolling and trying to control crime, because a lot of times it was just beats, there was really no oversight, there was no like department heads, things like that before. So he proposed a centralized police force that was focused on crime prevention and control. So instead of just being reactive to crimes, let's go out there and monitor areas and walk a beat and try to prevent crime from happening in the first place. He was one of the first people to recommend that. Okay, so that is, the classical school of thought in a nutshell. So people have free will. People are rational decision makers. We weigh the costs and benefits of things before we act on our emotions. People are pleasure seeking, and so we seek to maximize our pleasure and minimize our pain. By the end of the 1800s, classical criminology kind of faded and made way for positivism. The big reason for this is the fact that it was very hard to test classical criminology. It's very hard to test free will. It's very hard to even define what free will is sometimes. So it's hard to actually empirically test those things. So then came positivism, and positivism wanted to make up for the shortcomings of the classical school by trying to used the scientific method to study crime itself. The scientific method in the early or in the late 1800s was rudimentary at best. So they were doing things like um, studying cadavers that of people that had been known to commit crime, and writing down what their features were and things like that. So obviously they weren't, the most objective studies like we see today. But they were trying. They were trying to go one step further than the classical criminology. So they ended up just accepting something known as hard determinism. So hard determinism is saying that force their crime results from forces beyond the individual's control. So I mentioned determinism in last chapter. We were talking about things briefly, but if you forgot, determinism just means that if you have this, you are 100% going to commit criminal behavior. So let's say that if you are born with a higher, if you are born with low self control, you are going to be a criminal. 100%, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Like that would be considered hard determinism. So obviously, for obvious reasons, that is no longer an accepted viewpoint, and things started to positivism started off very, very crude, and it had taken a lot of steps since then to be, more in line with scientific thinking. But even so, in the 1970s, we had some studies come out that were focused on prisoners. And so, what was the outcome of prisoners? And they saw that the majority of people who enter prison and get released end up going back to prison. And so there was this cry out that nothing works. So because of that, and because of the fact that, okay, fixing things like um, neighborhood conditions, economic conditions, focusing on peer group influences, on socialization, on genetics, on biology, all these things are not having an effect on the recidivism rate. So why are we even bothering to spend money on all these social programs? Why not just, keep people locked up for forever? So we went back to this, get tough on crime type of policies. And so the resurgence of classical school ideas, because the classical school was very much based on punishment and how punishment can stop crime from happening in the future. So things changed in the 1970s from when classical criminology was, the only school of thought in criminology. And so we call it the neoclassical criminology, because neoclassical is just basically saying that we have our school of thought is based in the classical criminology, but it's more modern. So neoclassical criminology focused on the importance of character, which is really the kind of this soft determinism that we're talking about right here. Oh, where's my pointer? So this right here, soft determinism, would really be where neoclassical kind of falls in. So classical criminology says that everybody has free will and everyone has the ability to make these rational decisions on whether or not they should commit crime. Hard determinism says that it's not free will that makes people commit crimes. It is the fact it's things outside of their control, like socialization, genetics, economic conditions. So it's not something that people choose to do. It's something that they're forced into based on different factors. Soft determinism is kind of in the middle of these two things. So focusing on the importance of character. So free will is part of character. Also, things that are outside, like biology, genetics, things like that, will also make up a person's personality or character. So the focus is on the importance of character and the dynamics of character development. as well as the rational choices that people make when faced with opportunities for crime. So that is neoclassical criminology in a nutshell. Okay, so when we're looking at, who are the influential thinkers when it comes to neoclassical criminology, we can start with Robert Martinson. Robert Martinson was the one that came up with that study that said nothing works. So he's the one that did a huge national survey in the 1970s of different rehab programs that were available and offered in prisons. And what he did was he looked at all the different programs that were available and how successful the prisoners that took those programs were in not ending up back in prison. And he found that the majority of them, whether they completed classes or not, whether they participated in work, study, whether or not they had family visit them, whatever it was, that was the program. Most of them still went back to being criminals after they were released from prison. So here's where we get that nothing works kind of doctrine that received a lot of attention at the time. So this is when we went back to, well, if we're spending all this money on all these rehab programs, but nobody's actually getting rehab, then why are we spending that money, and let's just punish these people for the bad things that they've done. They're not getting better. They're not going to change. Let's just punish them. Around that same time, we had James Q. Wilson, who published a book called Thinking About Crime. He suggested that crime is not a result of poverty or social conditions, and so therefore, having social programs in place that address poverty and social conditions are not going to have any effect on the crime rate. So Wilson was influential in different policing practices, but one big thing that he argued for was lengthy incarceration. And that way, if you throw someone in prison, then you take away their ability to commit crime because they are no longer, in society with their free will, walking around, able to decide that they want to commit crimes. So also in the 1970s, we had David Fogel, who came up with this justice model. So the justice model was predicated on the growing belief that prisons don't actually rehabilitate or cure anybody, and that the criminal offenders deserve punishment because of the choices that they made. So again, we're going back to the fact that you made the conscious choice to commit this crime. And so instead of trying to rehab you or do anything because it's not something that can be rehabbed, you made this bad choice. And so you need to be punished for that bad choice. And that's all that we have to do. So this line of thinking led to legislation known as three strikes. So three strikes legislation is a reflection of the justice model because it also says that, okay, we have, so if you don't know what a three strikes law is, I guess I should explain that first. It means that if you have been convicted of two crimes and you are now in court for committing a third crime, they can uh, sentence you to a severe punishment. So whether it be a hefty fine, a lot of community service. Usually what this means though, when they're talking about the three strikes legislation, you're going to prison. And you're going to prison for a significant amount of time at this point. There is a discussion on the three strikes legislation and the theory versus reality box in your book. This YouTube video also discusses some things about the three strikes legislation and provides an example for it. If you just Google things right now, so there is a movement called Reform Justice. It's being led by like Jay-Z and Meek Mills. They came up with their own kind of criminal justice. reform group, and it's called Reform. And they highlighted a case over the summer where a man had been arrested for stealing, well, unsuccessfully stealing his neighbor's garden shears, which are just like a big pair of scissors. And he got sentenced to life in prison because it was his third strike. These are nonviolent crimes. He didn't even carry out the crime because he got caught doing it because he's not very good at committing crime. But he ended up getting a life in prison sentence because of it. I'm sure if you Google it'll come up. And these are the ideas behind this. So the thing, David Fogel would argue, well, we gave him opportunities to change and he didn't change, so that's where he belongs. Okay. Okay, so here is an actual theory for us to talk about. Rational choice theory falls under the neoclassical school of thought. And it mirrors many of the principles found in classical criminology. So the theory itself asserts that criminals make a conscious, rational, and at least partially informed choice to commit crime, and they employ what's known as a cost benefit analysis in order to decide whether or not they want to commit a crime. So this theory views human behavior as a result of personal choices that are made after rational decision making. So people who believe that the risks of crime outweigh the rewards don't commit crime. People who find the risks acceptable are more likely to try crime out. So if you were a bank robber, and you spent time, planning out your robbery. So you are well aware of what the punishment is. You know that if you rob this bank, you are going to get 10 years minimum in a federal prison. But you also know that if you are successful in this crime, you are going to be buying an island and you never have to talk to anybody again, and the chances of you getting caught because of that are so small. So if you can successfully pull this off, the benefits are going to greatly outweigh the risks. And you are confident as a bank robber that you can pull this off because you have been doing your homework, you're casing the joint, you're making sure that you know where the security cameras are, you know how to deactivate the security cameras, you know how to distract the guards, you know how to get in the vault, you know how to get the money, all these different things. When we say that rational choice theory um, really puts emphasis on both the characteristics of a specific criminal uh, act and the characteristics of the offender. So all the things that I was just describing, like where, how much security is there? Is it easy to distract security? What are my skills as a bank robber? Am I able to disable the cameras? Am I able to break in the vault? Am I able to remove the money? So all these things are things that me as a potential bank robber are going to be thinking about and weighing these things out before I go ahead and commit my crime. So, it's almost like making a pro con list and saying, okay, these are all the pros for me creating or for committing this crime, and these are all the cons. And at the end, if my pro list out is bigger than my con list, I'm going to go ahead and commit the crime. If not, if the con list is higher than the pro list, then I'm not going to commit the crime. So, this last bullet point, crime will decrease when opportunities are limited, benefits are reduced, and costs are increased. So, the whole idea is that when I want to rob this bank, but the only thing for me to rob is this, safe that is uncrackable. The uncrackable safe is the only place in this bank that has money. So my opportunity for being successful and stealing it are very small. Let's say that the bank across town, however, has, one big vault, but I know that they keep their money in drawers behind the counters. So, there my opportunities are not as limited. Benefits are reduced. So obviously, if there's not as much to steal, then you aren't likely to do it. So if you've ever gone to a gas station at night and you see a sign that says the gas attendant or the clerk does not have access to the safe, or that the safe is emptied at 5 o'clock and they don't carry any big bills at nighttime, or even a pharmacy where it says, uh, there's a time safe on the narcotics that are in there so that you can't get prescription opioids at any random time. So don't even try. So that's reducing the benefits or the potential benefits to a crime. And of course, increasing the cost. So saying, you will get caught, shoplifters will be prosecuted. If you do this, we will find you and you will get punished for it. That would be increasing the cost for any potential crime. Okay, so going along with rational choice theory, we have what is known as situational choice theory. So this is really an extension of rational choice theory. It just really adds one particular thing to it. So when we talk about situational choice theory, it is saying that people make a choice. They do a cost benefit analysis and they're making this choice. And so it's not enough to just have the motivation. We also need to have the opportunity. So let's say that I am a thief and I like to steal things when I can. And that's how I am. If I am in the situation that calls for it, I'm going to take money. But if I'm not in a situation that calls for it, then I will just go about living my life and you wouldn't even know. So, for example, if I went to a clothing store and I was, buying some clothes and I bought them instead of stole them because I saw that there were cameras, there were people walking around. This one annoying girl kept asking me if I needed any help, and so I didn't feel that I could, get away from with stealing anything from that store. Then let's say I go back the next day, and because I was there the day before, they remembered me, and they're not bothering me because I know I bought some stuff and no one's paying attention to me today. They're busy. They have a lot going on. There's a sale happening. There's chaos, and no one's looking at me. And so now I have the opportunity to take things, whereas the day before I didn't. So you need to have both the motivation and the opportunity to commit crime. At least that's what situational choice theory states. So if you can reduce or reduce the temptation to commit crime, change the features of the environment, then you can reduce the risk of being the victim of crime. So situational choice theory really puts a lot of focus and attention on situational prevention. So basically what they say is that crime prevention can be achieved by convincing would-be criminals that a particular target is not worth the effort. Effective crime prevention strategies must be aimed at reducing immediate and particular criminal opportunities, making it more difficult to engage in successful criminal enterprise. And so they recommend 5 different things on how to do that. Increase the effort involved in committing a crime. So increasing the effort by doing things like what's called target hardening. So target hardening techniques, things like putting up unbreakable glass, locking a gate that you put up, fencing in a yard, installing brighter lights, living in a gated community. All these things make it harder for a person to obtain the target. So increase the effort involved in committing a crime. Increase the risk associated with crime commission. So obviously, this is going to have to do with a lot with punishment. So increasing the risk associated with crime commission knowing that the punishment for a crime is significant, knowing that, maybe bragging about how often the local police are catching crimes, or catching criminals, making it aware that this behavior or this act is not going to be tolerated. Reduce the rewards of crime. So, so if we, reduce the rewards of crime, you're basically making it less appealing. So maybe instead of putting, let's say that I own a jewelry store and I want people to come into my store, so I want to advertise the pretty jewelry that I have, but I know that if I put this pretty jewelry out in the front of the store where there's not as much, where I can't really keep an eye on it, it's more likely to be stolen. So maybe instead of putting my most valuable and precious gems out there in the front, I'm going to put things like cubic zirconium. So it catches your eye, it draws you in, but if it gets stolen, it's not going to be, rewarding like a diamond would be. The person that stole it's going to be really upset. So reducing the rewards of crime. Reduce the provocations that led to criminal activity. So this in particular is interesting because um, it has become, common practice in criminology and criminal justice research to identify common factors that result in criminal behavior and then go ahead and reduce those factors. So, for example, reducing conflict through anger management programs. So, when people get angry, they often act out and create and commit crime. So, maybe referring that type of person to an anger management program where they can learn how to manage their anger and it won't automatically lead to crime. Um, Reducing the use of alcohol is often suggested as a way to reduce criminal activity. Um, Not every person that drinks alcohol is going to commit crime, but about 70% of all crimes have some type of alcohol involved. So we're not saying that alcohol causes criminal behavior, but it's highly correlated, it's highly associated with it. So reducing the amount of alcohol consumed by individuals could possibly lead to a reduction in crime also. Removing the excuses that facilitate crime commission. So saying things like, I didn't know it was illegal, or I had no choice. Make sure that crimes and the punishment for committing those crimes are well known, and that way that there is no excuse. If you know anything about criminal law, then you may know that what's known as, what's it called? I'm drawing a blank on the word that I'm trying. Ignorance. Ignorance of the law is not a excuse for breaking the law. If you got caught breaking the law and you went to court and said, "Well, I didn't know it was the law. I'm ignorant to that law," that they're not going to forgive you for it. It's not an excuse, because everything is written down these days. But you can remove the excuses even more. Let's say that you are, trying to reduce the amount of people speeding in a certain area, and you pull people over one day, and you have 5 people that you pulled over say, "I had no idea that I was speeding. I didn't know that the speed limit was only this in this area." So then you know what you do? You put up a big flashing sign that says speed limit this. You're going too fast, slow down. And that way, if they get pulled over afterwards, you can be like, "Well, did you see the huge flashing sign that told you to slow down?" And if they say no, say, "Well, I don't believe you," and you're going to get a ticket. All right, so situational choice theory, a lot of focus on preventing the types of crimes. Types of choices offenders make when moving toward criminal involvement are going to be kind of falling under these two categories. So involvement decisions include the initial decision to engage in criminal activity, as well as any follow-up decision to continue one's involvement, or maybe to desist from crime. So that's, something that we want to try to get them to do. So including in the initial decision to engage, And then you have all every other stage in order to try to prevent people from moving forward. Event decisions relate to particular instances of criminal opportunity, such as robbing a particular person or letting him pass. So event decisions are usually made quickly, where you just walk by somebody, and is this somebody that I should rob? Is this a potential victim? Do they have something that I want? Do they look like they're gonna fight me off? Do they look like they're armed? All these things happen very quickly, where involvement decisions often take, years of thought. They're well planned out, they're well thought. If you want to rob a bank versus a person, you're going to be casing the building. You're going to be looking for patterns of the employees that work there. You're going to be doing this stuff over a long period of time if you want to be successful. So uh, if you are trying to prevent crime from happening to your business or your home, then it would be good to take into consideration the fact that criminals sometimes plan these things out over a long period of time. So I know that if you're a female, you've probably heard this before. Men aren't necessarily always told these things, but a lot of times people will tell you to not to kind of change up your routine every once in a while. Don't take the same roads. Don't do the same jogging route. Don't leave the house every day at the same time. All these things could help. If somebody was stalking you and trying to figure out when the best time to commit criminal behavior was, you're going to throw them off their game if by switching these things up, because it's going to affect their involvement decisions. Okay, so situational crime control policy shifts the focus away from the offender and onto the context in which crime occurs. So here we are talking about, it's not necessarily the free will part that we're focusing on, and we don't necessarily want to focus on punishing people. We just don't want to get our stuff taken from us in the first place. We don't want to be a victim of crime in the first place. So what do we do to stop that from happening? Well, if we know that crime is more likely to occur in certain contexts, then we're going to focus on those contexts. We're going to focus on, the security around a building. So we know that well-lit areas tend to not experience as much crime as, poorly lit areas. So we're going to add more streetlights. We're going to add a spotlight. We're going to add, we're really going to brighten the place up. We're going to add visual security measures. So we're going to add security cameras. Maybe we'll have a guard walking around at night. Maybe we'll have a guard dog that is there and barking so somebody can hear. All of these things focus on the context in which the crime occurs and doesn't focus on any type of individual. So we have to know what the individual is thinking and how they think these things through in order to come up with these suggestions. But the focus is not on the person themselves, and it's not on punishment, rather on how do we stop this stuff from happening. Okay, so when we're talking about, rational decision making and rational people, then we often take for granted what and why people are committing crime. So usually, let's talk about bank robbery and, theft and stuff in general, because that fits the best with this theory. It can also apply to other crimes. The theft and burglary part is the easiest way to kind of get the picture across. And so here, the motivation for committing the crime would be whatever it is you took. So the money or the electronics or whatever, the jewelry, whatever it is that you stole from the person is the motivation for the crime, because you see something you want and you now figured out a way to take what you want, illegally. But this type of focus often kind of neglects the fact that some criminals do commit crime just for fun. They don't necessarily care what it is that they're walking away with. The crime itself is the motivation for them. The excitement that they feel from committing the crime is the reason why they make the crime. Is the reason why they commit the crime. So Jack Katz wrote a book, Seductions of Crime, where he talks about all these different things. And it's actually really interesting if you ever do read his book, because he makes a very good point where when we study crime in the academic world, we just look at it very fact based. So, what was the person doing? How were they doing it? Where were they doing it? What were the circumstances surrounding it? And we don't get into the emotional part of these types of things. Not usually, anyway. We do with maybe, the motivation for somebody, turning to a life of drugs, drug abuse, was that they lost a family member and this was their way of coping. And then they started doing drugs, and then they got addicted to drugs, and then they had to start stealing. So yes, emotions play a role in that, and we do focus on that a lot in our research. But what we don't focus on is things like, I committed that crime because it made me feel good. So you can see this right here, as a hands-on example of how some people feel when they commit crime. So obviously that is a problem, especially when criminologists often depict crime as something to be avoided. So if we're saying that you're weighing the cost benefit of committing this crime, and the cost is the fear of getting caught, the idea that society is against this, the idea that committing crime is bad, if all these things are something that a person is supposed to rely on to not commit crime, we're missing a big picture of criminals that don't feel that way. So it's important for criminologists to understand that crime feels good to some people, and that can explain their reason for wanting to commit crime. So Katz in particular argues for a redirection of the criminological gaze from the traditional background factors, things like age, age, race. Those are things that we always look at. Age, race, sex are always things that we look at when we're looking at why people commit crime. Socioeconomic status. But this is saying, instead of focusing on those things, we need to focus on situational factors that directly precipitate criminal acts and reflect crime's sensuality. So basically a different way of looking at criminal behavior um, overall. Because instead of focusing on material motivations, we have emotional motivations as well. Okay, so critiques of rational choice theory. There are several. There is an overemphasis on individual choice with little regard for the role of social factors. So when we talk about rational choice theory, we are only talking about the fact that people are making a rational choice as to whether or not they should commit this crime. Let's say that a person hasn't eaten in 10 days because they lost their job, they're in a bad way, whatever the situation is, and they go in and they steal a loaf of bread. Um, in the eyes of rational choice theory, that person weighed the benefits and the risks and decided that the benefit of eating was better than the benefit of getting caught stealing and getting whatever punishment for it. But it doesn't take into any of the social factors of that person. So, how many people are out there that are starving that never steal anything? What is different about this person versus the other people? The social factors might explain something like that. It does not consider the impact of emotional states or psychopharmacological aids. So basically, this theory does not apply to the mentally ill or other irrational populations, which, if you are under the influence of drugs or alcohol, you would be another irrational population. So it's in the name of the theory, rational choice. But not everyone is able to make rational decisions. Maybe somebody has a mental illness. Maybe they are under the influence of something that makes them act like they have a mental illness. And therefore, these people are not necessarily performing a cost benefit analysis before they commit a crime. That goes along with the next bullet too. Individuals are not the best at realistic appraisals of risk and reward. So this is a big one too. So if you are a criminal and you are trying to weigh the risk and reward of committing this crime, you probably are not going to accurately weigh the risks and the benefits. If you know somebody who committed a crime and they got away with it, you might think your chances of getting caught are really low, even though maybe that's not the case for that particular crime in that area. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes people are sure that they're going to get caught, but that is not a likely possibility. So, most people aren't very good at realistically judging that situation. Before I get to the last one, I want to also say that rational choice theory ignores social concern. So basically, this theory states that if people, weigh the costs and benefits, and it says that they are going to get punished and they don't want to get punished, so they choose not to commit crime. And that's just saying that that's the only way that people will choose not to commit crime, is if they think that the punishment is going to outweigh the reward. And if that was the case, I think we would see a lot more crime happening. But some criminologists suggest that many people are socially concerned and that this state of mind provides a natural restraint against crime. So social concern and self-interest can exist side by side. So I could still, want the best for me and want to look out for me, and what's best for me. And part of what's best for me is having everyone in my neighborhood like me and having everyone in my neighborhood respect me. And if I get caught committing a crime, I'm going to lose all of that respect and, all the people that like me that I've worked so hard to get. Because if I have these people in my corner, I'm only going to, move up. And if I don't have them in my corner, then it's going to be a really extreme challenge for me. So, social concern is definitely going to influence people on and what they think that and what they think about committing crime. Also, things like empathy, moral compass, societal concern are all ignored in rational choice theory. This last point where it says target hardening can lead to displacement. So that's a big one. What this is saying is that when you make it harder to commit a crime in some areas, so if you increase the amount of police presence in a neighborhood, oftentimes you'll see the crime rate in that neighborhood go down, and people will say, "Hey, look, this works. We made these get tough policies. We put the police out there on the beat. They're out there walking around. People can see, well, it's not worth selling drugs on this corner anymore because the police are walking around." But does that mean they stop selling drugs altogether? Research shows no, that's not typically the case. When we make it harder to commit crime in one area, we often see that crime rate in that area drop and the crime rates in the surrounding areas go up. And so you might have heard this, especially over the last election, where you hear things like, "Oh, the suburbs, all the crimes going to the suburbs. We got to watch out for the middle class in the suburbs. Suburbia is under attack." And it was a big scare tactic because this has always been the case. When you have a lot of crime in a city and you put a lot of police in that city to try to crack down on that crime, some of the criminals are going to stop and some of them are just going to move. And so target hardening can potentially lower the crime rate in one area and raise it in another. So that obviously is a problem. Okay, so the big parts of neoclassical thought is going to be focused on punishment. So in classical criminology, punishment is a deterrent. And how do you stop crime from happening? You punish it. And if you punish it the right way, you're hopefully going to stop crime from happening. Neoclassical thought just adds to that and says, retribution should also be a part of punishment, not just deterrence. So if you subscribe to the neoclassical thought, you would say that a criminal deserves to be punished because the consequences of crime were known to the offender before the crime was committed and they chose to do it anyway. They must be punished so that future criminal behavior can be curtailed. So they deserve it and they have to do it if we want to deter it. Um, in this type of view, justice is nothing more or less than what the individual deserves when all circumstances surrounding that person's situation and behavior are taken into account. Just desserts is basically saying that we want things to be fair. Criminal offenders deserve the punishment they receive at the hands of the law, and any punishment imposed should be appropriate to what the crime that they committed. So, just desserts is all about fairness. If you committed this crime, you get this punishment, and that's that. You deserve it. That's your dessert. Okay, so let's talk more about deterrence because if we're talking about punishment being a deterrent, we want to know, what that is and what that looks like. So, deterrence is the prevention of crime through fear of punishment. And there are two types of deterrence. There's specific deterrence and general deterrence. Most of our talk is going to focus on general deterrence, so let's start with that one. General deterrence is that when we make laws, we are making them with the hopes of preventing people from committing crimes similar to the one for which someone is being sentenced. So when we make so let's talk about capital punishment. That's the best one for general deterrence. If we pass a law that says if you murder somebody, you are going to get the death penalty. Well, now I know that committing murder is a crime, and I know that the punishment is my own death. So knowing that is out there should hopefully be enough to stop me from committing that crime. And that's general deterrence. Specific deterrence, well, let me go back one more. So, knowing that that is a law out there, knowing that's the punishment out there should be enough for me to stop crime. Even more deterrence is expected if I know somebody who was arrested and punished for that crime. So if I know someone who murdered someone, they got caught by the police, and then they were sentenced to death themselves, that had nothing to do with me in particular, but now I've seen it firsthand. I know it's a thing. I know that's the law, and I should be even more deterred from doing something similar. Specific deterrence is basically that same thing, but for an individual. So let's say that I am a thief and I stole a car. I'm a car thief. So I stole someone's car. I got caught, and now I'm getting whatever punishment for it. So I'm getting sentenced to, let's say, 5 years in prison for, stealing someone's car. So that punishment of 5 years in prison should be enough to stop me from wanting to do it again. So it's just, it's me. When I commit this crime, I get a punishment, and that punishment should deter me from committing crime in the future. That's known as specific deterrence. So it is said that general deterrence would be achieved if three things are met. So the first one is, those three things are certainty, swiftness, and severity. So general deterrence would be achieved if, number one, the police are effective in detecting crime and apprehending criminals. Number 2, judges and juries were sure to convict the guilty, who would then, number 3, endure harsh criminal punishments shortly after having committed the crime. So when people believe they have a high probability of getting caught and punished for their crime, that should serve as a deterrent. So the higher the arrest rate, the lower the subsequent crime rate is the idea behind it. The belief is that people who believe they will be punished severely for a crime will forego committing criminal acts. Best when the punishment fits the crime. So we're going to go through that in a little more detail on the next slide. Yeah. Actually, no, we're going to talk about it here right now. So, how do we know if deterrence works? The best way to tell if this is working is to look at the recidivism rate. So, if we are giving people punishments and the punishments are meant to stop them from committing more crime, we need to look at if they are committing more crime after they are done serving their punishment. And unfortunately, recidivism rates are very high in the US. There are some studies that find 80 to 90%. I would say a safe estimate is about 65% of all prisoners that are released from prison end up back in prison. And maybe this 80 to 90% recidivism also includes people that are on probation or parole. But still, that's a lot. That's more than half of the people that are leaving are coming back. So we can see that it's not necessarily having the deterrent, punishment is not necessarily having the deterrent effect that we want. Okay, so those who advocate for punishment as a deterrent are often frustrated by the complexity of today's criminal justice system and by the slow and circuitous manner in which cases are handled and punishments are meted out. So if you are a proponent of deterrence and this is what you think is, going to help lower the crime rate, there are a couple of things that kind of stand in your way. One of the things is that one of the things is the idea of certainty. So let's go through the three things that need to happen for deterrence to be a thing. The first one is certainty. So certainty of punishment today is really not a thing. So we talk about clearance rates for crimes, and clearance rates mean the number of crimes that were solved out of all of the crimes that were reported. The highest clearance rate for any crime is for murder, and that's at about 60%. So about 60% of all murders are solved. And that's the highest one. So I think, I'm not entirely sure what all the numbers are, but I think that that theft is at like 15% clearance rate. So if you are a thief and you know these numbers, which they probably don't, but if you know these numbers and you're a thief, you're thinking, wow, I have an 85% chance of getting away with this crime. So obviously certainty is not necessarily a thing with getting caught. If you are caught, however, and punishment is actually handed down, they're frequently not carried out, or at least not carried out into the same severity as they are when they're doled down. So, you might get a sentence of 5 years in prison and you might get out in 2.5 years for good behavior or whatever it is. So certainty is not necessarily a thing at this moment in time in our history. Swiftness. Sorry, I'm just making sure that I hit all the points. So let's go to swiftness. So swiftness is another one that we often cannot achieve in this day and age. The idea behind it is that the more rapidly punishment is applied and the more closely it's linked to the client or to the crime, the more likely it is to serve as a deterrent. But it takes a long time for a person, well, if the person is not caught actually committing the crime in the act, then we have to wait for them to get arrested. And if they're not caught by a police officer while they're committing the act, we have to go through the judicial process of securing probable cause, of getting a warrant, of doing maybe a search, and then finally we have this criminal in custody, alleged criminal in custody. Then we have to go through, the court process of proving whether or not that person actually did commit the crime. Obviously, there's a reason why we it takes a while because we want to make sure that we get it right. We want to make sure that there's evidence. We want to make sure that we aren't convicting an innocent person of committing a crime that they didn't commit. So it takes a while for people to gather evidence, to get eyewitnesses, to interview people, to put the case together. So then we go through the sentencing phase. And let's say that they are, convicted and then they're handed down a sentence. And let's say that that sentence is, let's go to the death penalty. I don't want to give away anything, but we're going to give away a little bit right now with the death penalty. So, for people who are actually sentenced to capital punishment or the death penalty in the United States, which is happening less and less nowadays. But if you do get that sentence, the average time spent on death row before an execution is actually carried out, I want to say, I have it written down. Was 19 years and 8 months in 2018. So people spend an average of about 20 years on death row before anything happens. And it doesn't always result in an actual execution. Sometimes people die of natural causes. Sometimes they're commuted to life without the possibility of parole. Sometimes they're exonerated by the governor or by someone else. So it's not certain that that's actually going to get carried out, and it's absolutely not swift. So, swiftness is not necessarily a thing that we can do with our legal system today. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of protections put in place to make sure that we are not punishing innocent people. So, we can't really take them away in order just to make sure that we have swiftness of punishment because we want to make sure we get it right. Okay, then severity. Severity is the last one. Severity is the one that we can kind of rely on the most. So we can make laws that say this is the accompanied punishment for this crime. And when we do that, we can make them as severe as necessary and everyone is aware of what it is. The idea is that we want to have a punishment that fits the crime. If you do something that's too lenient, then and people are, weighing the cost benefit analysis and they're like, oh, I can steal this watch that's worth $10,000 and I'm only going to get a fine of $500. Totally worth it to steal the watch. Why wouldn't I steal the watch? I'm going to make $9,500. Why wouldn't I steal it? So that's an idea. So if you watch the Super Bowl, I have a really good example of this. If you watched the Super Bowl last year, February 2021, you saw a streaker. A guy ran out on the field, and was streaking on the field during the Super Bowl. He, then got caught and arrested and he was bailed out. I think it was like $1,000 bail or something like that. And he had to do a little bit of community service. He had made a bet, however, earlier in the day that there would be a streaker during the Super Bowl. And he had, actually made so much money by doing that. So he knew that, his payout was going to be something ridiculous. I can't remember the numbers anymore, but he was going to get a huge payout if there was a streaker on the field, for this bet that he made. And he knew that if he was the streaker on the field, he was only going to have a small fine to pay and that it wasn't going to be a huge legal deal for him. So he decided rationally that it was totally worth it for him to do it. What he didn't know or think about or consider was the fact that the people who he made the bet with then found out it was him that was streaking, and then therefore it was nullified the bet. So he had to deal with the legal issues, and he didn't actually get the reward that he wanted to. So sucks for him, I guess. But if you're thinking about that, then that's an example of the severity of the punishment not being enough to deter someone from committing the crime of streaking. If you go the opposite and you are too harsh in your punishment, then that causes a whole separate line of problems. If people do not think that sentences are fair, if they think they are unjustly harsh, then that can cause a sense of uh, resistance to following the rules because they're not fair. I don't see why this punishment has to be so harsh, and so I'm not going to listen to it. I don't believe in it. I'm not going to listen to it. And then you have that kind of feeling of rebellion that comes along with that, which is we've seen it play out in history before, and it's not doesn't normally end well. So for all those reasons, deterrence, punishment does not seem to be the deterrent that we would like it to actually be. Alrighty, let's try and move to the next slide. Okay, so this image comes straight from your book, but it's a really good way of kind of putting this into perspective. So one reason that recidivism is so high may be that punishments are rarely applied to the majority of offenders, and this is showing that. So not only are a lot of offenders never actually caught and arrested by the police, but those that are not always given an actual punishment. And so this is this is called the crime funnel, which actually shows that less than 1% of all criminal law violators can be expected to spend time in prison as a punishment for their crimes. So how this is looking is that all these people that are red committed a felony. Then, they were all arrested, they committed a felony, or actually, no, I'm sorry. That's not what I meant. All these people committed a felony, probably self-reported. So 38 million people self-reported committing a felony. 10.3 million of those are actually reported to the police. So as you can see right here, they're not even a third of all of these crimes are actually reported to the police. So these are only the ones that come to the attention of the police. And that's just reported. Only 3.8 million of those that are actually reported to the police end up in an arrest. And this is going to be for various reasons. You have to have probable cause. You have to have evidence. So even if you say, hey, I'm the victim of this crime, come figure it out for me, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to end up in an arrest. Excuse me. So out of the 3.8 million people that are actually arrested, only 1.1 million are actually convicted. And so you are convicted of committing a felony. You have other options other than going to prison. So most offenders processed by the justice system are either released, fined, or placed on probation. So after you're convicted, you have other options. So out of the 1.1 million people that are convicted, about 700,000 of them are sent to prison every single year. So that's not a small number. There are a lot of people in our prisons. Our prisons are way overcrowded. We've already talked about all that stuff with the amount of people that go back afterwards. But this is just showing that, the three things that come with that need to happen in order for deterrence, for punishment to really be a deterrent: the swiftness, the certainty, the severity. It's just not there in the way that our legal system is designed. Okay, so capital punishment. I could literally spend an entire class period on capital punishment, but if you've made it this far in the video, then I know that you don't want me to do that. So when we're talking about capital punishment, we are talking about, executions. There are, many arguments that go for and against capital punishment, but one thing that you cannot deny, no matter where you stand on the topic of capital punishment, is that it is the ultimate deterrent. If you commit a murder and you are sentenced to capital punishment, then you will not be committing any more murder because you are going to be on death row. And unless you escape death row somehow, and then go on a killing spree, you're not getting out to commit any more murders. So this is really the only punishment that you can say 100% stops future crime from happening, because they're dead. So let's go into some detail. So there is a lot of pushback against capital punishment, especially in society today. Um, and honestly, for good reason, unfortunately. So I used to be a huge proponent of the death penalty. Um, Texas really uses the death penalty a lot compared to other states. So you may also be a strong proponent of the death penalty. And my reasons for, supporting the death penalty was obviously the deterrent factor is a big one. Also, the fact that I assumed that it costs less to do an execution than it does to hold somebody in prison for life without parole. Um, I also, I was told that that's not true. Um, mm, mm, mm. So we'll go through all these different reasons one by one. So I'm not going to go over this list. You can read the list, but there are the three things that you need to have a death penalty be a deterrent. So one of the reasons to support the death penalty would to say, okay, well, it serves as a deterrent. Well, like I just went over, it does serve for specific deterrents. If you sentence an individual to death, then they are not going to want to commit, they're not going to be able to commit any more murder. So specific deterrents, yes. General deterrents, no, not so much. Remember that you need to have the three criteria: certainty, severity, and swiftness. So there's only about 65% of all homicides are cleared by police to begin with. So the certainty is definitely not there in that instance. You have a high probability of not ever being caught for the murder that was committed. And then, whether or not the sentence actually gets carried out, a lot of times people on death row have their sentences commuted to life in prison instead. So the certainty is, not there. The swiftness, we just talked about this. The average time spent on death row in 2018 was 19 years and 8 months. So the swiftness is definitely not there either. And that's just from the time that the trial starts. That's not even including, whatever time it took for the arrest to be made. So swiftness is definitely not there. Severity, however, that one is covered. So you cannot get any more severe than the death penalty. And so you got the severity for it. Okay, so reasons to support the death penalty would be that it's a deterrent. However, research has shown that that is false. States with the death penalty tend to have higher homicide rates than those without the death penalty. So for as much as Texas uses their death penalty, um, the murder rate in Texas is significantly higher than some states that don't have the death penalty as an option. So also another reason that you might think to support the death penalty would be that it's more cost effective than life in prison. But again, that would be false. In 2017, death penalty case costs from prosecution to execution. So just from the start of the trial to execution, averaged $1.26 million. So $1.26 million per death penalty case in 2017, while life imprisonment cases life imprisonment cases from prosecution to end of incarceration cost $740,000. So significantly cheaper for the life imprisonment. And end of incarceration could mean that they were let go after a certain amount of time. I know it says life imprisonment, but if it doesn't say without the possibility of parole, you can get out. But it also could mean that that person actually died in prison. So end of incarceration. So 1.26 million for the death penalty and 740,000 for life in prison. Some of the reasons for the high cost of the death penalty are things like the longer trials. Obviously, it takes a lot for a capital murder trial because you do not want to be sentencing somebody who did not commit the crime to death. So you have to take a long time preparing and going through the trial part. An appeal is automatic when you are sentenced to death. So if you receive the death penalty as a convicted offender, your case automatically goes into appeals. Normally, if you get convicted of a crime, then you have the right to appeal the court's decision. You don't have to. When it's a death penalty case, it's automatic. It automatically goes through the appeals process. So then you have, uh, then you have the need for more lawyers and experts on both sides of the case, and the relative rarity of executions all cost money. So the state of Florida spent about $25 million per execution. There is evidence that one county in Texas had their taxes raised by 8% to pay for just one execution. So the relative rarity of executions also makes things cost money because you have to find people to carry this stuff out and to make sure that, equipment is ready and supplies are ready and all those other things. So let's see. I should say that at year end of 2018, 30 states and the federal Bureau of Prisons held 2,628 prisoners on death row. California, Florida, and Texas had half of all death row inmates. 8 states executed a total of 25 prisoners in 2018, and Texas accounted for 13 of those deaths. So, like I said, Texas actually uses the death penalty more than the others. But it costs money. They actually can see that taxes were raised in direct need to pay for an execution. So, it costs everybody money. Okay, so the retribution aspect is both true and false. So, are you getting the retribution aspect when you have the death penalty? Well, if you got the right person, then yes, you are getting your retribution. But there are potentially innocent people on death row. And I say potentially, but it has been proven people have been exonerated after spending years and years on death row. And new evidence comes to light, or somebody speaks up, or something happens, and people that have been sentenced to death have been found to not be guilty, and that is a big deal because that is the state taking an innocent person's life. So that's a big deal. There is something called the Innocence Project, which is run, I think, out of Michigan. me, I think out of the University of Michigan. I'm not 100% sure where it's run out of, but the Innocence Project is made up of lawyers and law students, and they take on cases, especially death penalty cases where people have been convicted, and try to, go through the case and look for any errors that were made and try to exonerate people that shouldn't be there. So, according to the Innocence Project, 18 people have been proven innocent and exonerated by DNA testing after serving time on death row. And that doesn't sound like a lot, 18 when we have 2,000 people on death row, but it takes a long time for this stuff to go through. Was there any DNA evidence to be had at the crime? Do you have somebody that will match the DNA? Do you have the ability to take the DNA to a crime lab to get tested at all? Because in some small areas, they don't have that kind of ability. So there, the possibility of executing somebody who did not commit the crime. Some people would argue that the there's a small possibility of that happening, and it's worth it as long as we can keep the death penalty and make sure that murderers are also being executed. And then there's, people on the complete opposite side that will say that no innocent life is ever worth it. So anytime that you risk putting someone innocent to death, that's a reason to get rid of the death penalty. Okay, so this last point, or this number nine right here, capital punishment is widely viewed as inhumane and barbaric internationally. That is true, and it is starting to affect the United States. So normally, we as a country don't really care what other people think about us, which is fine. But sometimes it actually affects us. And this way, in particular, is affecting the way that capital punishments are being carried out. So I can't remember the year. I want to say in 2011. It might be off by that. That might be that might be a few years off. But it was around then where every state officially adopted using the three drug method in order to carry out executions. So no more electric chair. The last person before that was mandated was killed by firing squad out in Utah, because they were allowed to choose how they wanted to go. But we don't do that anymore. It's not an option. So usually there's a drug that's called pentobarbital, and that is given to prisoners, and it basically stops their heart. But the pentobarbital method is not without its problems, in large part because U.S. pentobarbital supply for executions is limited. One of the drug's main manufacturers is a European company called Lundbeck, and they have not sold anything to the US for execution since 2011. So states that use it sometimes have to take matters into their own hands with occasionally questionable results. And we've heard some terrible horror stories. If you Google, you would find some terrible horror stories of, you know, states getting it wrong, people getting it wrong when they're trying to do their three drug cocktail for a execution, and it ends up, causing unnecessary pain, which is not the point. The point is not to carry out pain. The whole point of the state taking over the punishment is to just apply the punishment without having all that extra retribution added into it. So not only is that a problem, but the American Medical Association has, come out against the death penalty for anybody. And that also means that any member of the American Medical Association who is caught administering the drugs to carry out an execution can actually lose their medical license. So you have oftentimes had people who have no idea what they're doing giving these shots, because you can't get a registered nurse to do it without fear of losing their medical license. So all these things are issues that we have carrying out the death penalty, and all these things can be reasons to argue, why we shouldn't possibly, get rid of it. The one thing that you can't ever argue is that one thing that you can't ever argue about is the fact that uh, some people will say that that some crimes are just so heinous that they deserve to end up with the death penalty. And if that's how you feel about something, there's really no argument for that. That's how you believe, that's how you feel, and that's fine. If that's the case, then you're in support of the death penalty, and that's that. Okay, so we went through all of the nitty gritty with rational choice theory, situational crime theory, and classical school of thought and deterrence in general. So, what policy implications come from this line of thought? Well, as you could probably tell, they have to do with punishment because that's what we're talking about, all about punishment. So here we're talking about things like determinate sentencing, which mandates a specified and fixed category of time to be served for every offense category. So all these things tended to take place really in the 70s when this neoclassical school came to light. Um, Before that, judges and parole boards had a lot of discretion. Well, this has to do particularly with judges. Judges had a lot of discretion in their sentencing. They could take into account external circumstances, different factors, and they had a wide range of punishments that they could choose from, and it was really up to them to make the choice. Determinate sentencing takes that choice away from the judges and puts it into law. So, for example, a judge could be required to sentence an armed robber to 7 years of prison, uh, and a robber who doesn't have a weapon maybe is required to only be sentenced to 1 year of prison. And the judge may think that the person who did the unarmed robbery actually caused more harm than the person who did armed robbery, but their hands are tied. They can't sentence them to, anything harsher than what's on the books with the determinate sentencing. Then we have what's known as truth in sentencing. So when we talk about truth in sentencing, we mean that the law will then require offenders to serve a long portion of their sentence before being released. Parole boards used to have significant say in when a prisoner could be released from prison. They had different programs set up, ways that you could earn merits. So things like being on your good behavior, participating in rehabilitation programs, maybe helping out with something, could earn you merits and actually take time off of your prison sentence. But the 1970s saw a change to get tough policies, and this changed so that now a prisoner has to serve the majority of their sentence regardless of any type of merit-based program that they have. So typically 80% or more has to be served before you can be released. This obviously has an impact on our uh, prison system where our prison population in the United States has increased 700% since 1970. And a lot of it is thought to be due to this truth in sentencing, where once you're in, and you can't get out by just due to being on your best behavior. So imprisonment is obviously one of the uh, big policy implications from this school of thought. Um, Incapacitating the offender. The thought of it is that they can't commit crime when they are imprisoned, and they are hopefully going to be so against going back there that they won't commit any future crimes as well. So incapacitation during formative crime years, which typically are young adulthood, should reduce the lifetime opportunity to commit crime since most people age out of crime over time. However, there seems to be a tipping point. Mass incarceration destabilizes society, producing higher crime rates altogether. So this tipping point basically says that once you imprison too many people, once you pass this one point, you actually destabilize society. So, we can talk about this in particular with certain cohorts of individuals. If you look at the federal prison population and you break it down by age, race, sex, background characteristics, you can see that the number of young black males aged like 18 to 24-ish tend to make up a large portion of the prisoners in federal prison. That doesn't mean that they commit more crime. It just means that they make up the largest amount of prisoners. Um, and why this matters is because if one, I think the numbers are something like 1 in 4 black males in that age group are incarcerated or have been incarcerated. And when that's the case, it really destabilizes where those people are coming from. So if you are in a primarily black neighborhood, and you don't see any young black males from this age are walking around, it might be because they're all serving prison time. And so what does that do to the actual neighborhood itself? What does that actually do to the community? What does that actually do to future generations of that community? It has a negative effect once we start going crazy and start imprisoning too many people. It can actually start having, significant negative effects other than the fact that we spend a lot of money as a country on incarceration. So, in sum, there is little clear-cut evidence that the nation's decades-long incarceration binge has produced the expected results. So, we would like to say that we have seen the crime rate decrease over the last 20 or so years, although it's just recently gone up. But if we don't talk about the um, most recent years, so up from like 1970 to 2019, we've seen not 1970, from the mid 1990s, early 2000s to about 2019, we saw a significant reduction in all crimes. We also saw a significant increase in arrests and in prison and prisoners. So people who support these ideas would say, that shows that we have made a difference. But your book goes in a little bit more detail. But we can see that, it's not necessarily a causal relationship. The greater amount of people that are in prison is not necessarily the cause of lower crime rates. Again, the last page of this chapter has more information, has more specific information on that. But we can't make that conclusion. So it really has not been shown to produce the expected results. And it actually may have done a lot more harm than good. Again, your book goes into more detail about that, but things like the cost of prisons, the amount of money that our country spends on prisons is starting to, go above and beyond what we spend on education for our young individuals, and that's a problem. Uh, Destabilizing neighborhoods, destabilizing certain populations in particular, disenfranchising individuals from the political system, because if you have a felony, up until recently at least, you weren't allowed to vote. And even now, not everyone who was committed a felony is allowed to vote. So there are a lot of things that come along with imprisonment that are kind of considered um, they were unintended consequences, and unfortunately, they seem to be negative, unintended consequences.
Okay, so this chart is taken right from your book, and it's just showing, the prison population in more detail. So, like I said, we started with these get tough policies in the 1970s, and as you can see, it has just increases since then. Okay, so critiques of classical and neoclassical theories. Overall, um, this type of thought represents more of a philosophy of justice than it does a simple theory of crime causation. This is really, like I keep saying, a school of thought, because if you subscribe to this school of thought, it's going to influence the way that you think about criminology and crime control strategies and things like that. But but classical and neoclassical themselves are not a theory. Rational choice theory, situational crime prevention theory, those things are theories. Both of these schools of thought tend to um, lack a appreciation for deeper sources of personal motivation. They focus more on the free will versus any external circumstances or any type of personal characteristics. They typically lack scientific backing because, like I said, there is enough evidence out there to show that people are not necessarily good at making rational choices, and so that goes against this theory in particular. Also, the policy implications of the imprisonment don't necessarily have positive results. So these theories this school of thought is a great jumping off point, and it definitely should be thought of when we are talking about criminological theories and other criminological theories throughout the semester. But these ones in particular kind of have fallen out of favor in the eyes of the criminologists, at least for now. They may come back strong again, but with all the data that we have now on how the Get Tough policies just seem to cost taxpayers lots and lots and lots of money, and don't ever necessarily have the positive results of lower crime that we want, that has a big influence on where these theories stand within criminology.